Marcus didn't know what was inside those plastic bags under the seat when he climbed into that truck, and when the driver said if you tell the police anything the cartel will find you and kill you, it wasn't just a threat. The Texas sun was merciless at 2 p.m., turning the highway into a shimmering ribbon of heat that made Marcus's eyes water. He'd been walking along Interstate 10 for 4 hours since his ride dropped him off at a rest stop, and his water bottle had been empty for the last 2 hours. His phone showed no signal, and the next town was still 30 miles away. But Marcus had no idea that his real problems were just beginning. Standing on the shoulder with his thumb extended, Marcus watched as another 18-wheeler approached in the distance. Most truckers didn't stop for hitchhikers anymore. Insurance issues, company policies, too many horror stories. But this one was slowing down. The massive Peterbilt pulled over about 100 yards ahead, its air brakes hissing like an angry snake. Marcus jogged toward the truck, grateful for any relief from the brutal heat. The driver leaned out of the window as Marcus approached. He was a heavy-set man in his 40s with a thick black beard and mirrored sunglasses. A faded baseball cap covered most of his hair, and his arms were covered in tattoos that Marcus couldn't quite make out from this angle. "Where you headed, amigo?" the driver called out in accented English. "West," Marcus replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "California, eventually. Anywhere you're going is fine." The driver studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Climb up. I'm going to Los Angeles." Marcus grabbed the door handle and pulled himself up into the cab. The air conditioning hit him like a blessing, and he sank into the passenger seat with relief. "Name's Carlos," the driver said, shifting the truck back into gear. "Carlos Mendez." "Marcus Chen, thanks for stopping, man. I was starting to cook out there." As they merged back onto the highway, Marcus noticed that the cab was unusually clean and organized. No fast food wrappers, no travel mugs, no CB radio chatter. Carlos kept the truck immaculate, which seemed odd for a long-haul driver. But there were other things that didn't quite add up. Carlos claimed to be hauling furniture to Los Angeles, but when Marcus glanced in the side mirror, he could see that the trailer doors were secured with multiple heavy-duty locks. Way more security than furniture would require, and Carlos kept checking his mirrors obsessively, far more than normal highway driving would warrant. "You do this run often?" Marcus asked, making conversation. "Often enough," Carlos replied, but something in his tone suggested he didn't want to elaborate. They drove in relative silence for the next hour, the only sound the rumble of the diesel engine and the whisper of the air conditioning. Marcus was starting to doze off when Carlos suddenly pulled off the highway at an unmarked exit. "Pit stop," Carlos explained before Marcus could ask. But this wasn't like any truck stop Marcus had ever seen. It was just a small, isolated building surrounded by empty desert, with no signs, no other vehicles, and no indication of what kind of business it might be. "I'll be right back," Carlos said, climbing down from the cab. "Stay here." As Carlos walked toward the building, Marcus noticed something that made his stomach clench. Under the passenger seat, partially visible now that he was sitting higher, were several plastic bags filled with white powder. A lot of plastic bags. Marcus's mouth went dry. He'd hitchhiked enough to know what he was looking at, and it definitely wasn't furniture supplies. But before he could fully process what he'd discovered, Carlos was walking back toward the truck, and he wasn't alone. 2 other men were with him, younger, harder looking, with a kind of casual menace that made Marcus's survival instincts start screaming. One of them was carrying a briefcase. The other had his hand resting on something under his jacket. Carlos climbed back into the driver's seat, and Marcus tried to act like he'd been sleeping. "Good news," Carlos said, but his voice had changed. It was colder now, more businesslike. "My friends want to meet you." "That's okay," Marcus said quickly. "I don't want to be any trouble. Maybe you could just drop me off at the next town." Carlos laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm afraid that's not an option anymore. amigo. The truck began moving again, but instead of getting back on the highway, Carlos drove deeper into the desert on a dirt road that Marcus hadn't even noticed. That's when Marcus realized he wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was in a truck full of drugs, in the middle of nowhere, with a man who clearly had no intention of letting him leave. "Carlos," Marcus said carefully, "I haven't seen anything, I don't know anything, I don't want any trouble." Carlos glanced at him in the rearview mirror, and Marcus could see his own reflection in those mirrored sunglasses. "The problem, Marcus, is that you've already seen too much. Those bags under your seat, they contain about $20 million worth of pure Colombian cocaine. And the people I work for don't like witnesses." Marcus felt the world tilt around him. $20 million, Colombian cocaine, the cartel. "I won't say anything," Marcus said, hearing the desperation in his own voice. "I swear I'll forget this ever happened." Carlos pulled the truck to a stop in a clearing surrounded by scrub brush and rocks. In the distance, Marcus could see the mountains, but there was no sign of civilization anywhere. "Here's the thing," Carlos said, turning to face Marcus directly. "The people I work for have a very simple policy when it comes to witnesses. They don't leave them alive." But Marcus had noticed something Carlos didn't realize he'd seen. When Carlos had climbed back into the truck, he'd left his cell phone on the dashboard, and the screen was still lit up, showing a text message thread with someone named Gefe. The last message, sent just minutes ago, read, "Package secured. Passenger is a problem. Instructions." The response had come immediately. "Eliminate the problem." Marcus's blood turned to ice. He wasn't just a witness anymore. He was a dead man walking. But Carlos was still talking, apparently enjoying the psychological torture of explaining Marcus's situation. "You see, this isn't just a one-time thing. I run this route twice a month, every month, 20 million each trip. The cartel has too much invested in this operation to let some hitchhiker compromise it." Carlos reached under his seat and pulled out a gun, not a small pistol, but a serious-looking automatic weapon. "Nothing personal, Marcus. Just business." But Marcus had learned something important during his years of hitchhiking. When there's no good option, sometimes you have to create one. Instead of begging or trying to reason with Carlos, Marcus suddenly lunged forward and grabbed the steering wheel, yanking it hard to the right. The massive truck lurched violently, throwing both men against the passenger side of the cab. Carlos cursed and fought to regain control, the gun flying out of his hand and sliding under the seat. Marcus used the confusion to throw open the passenger door and leap out of the moving truck. He hit the desert floor hard, rolling and scrambling to his feet. As the truck skidded to a stop about 50 yards away, behind him he could hear Carlos shouting in rapid Spanish, and it didn't sound friendly. Marcus ran. The desert terrain was brutal. Loose rocks, thorny plants, and heat that seemed to suck the moisture right out of his lungs. But Marcus kept running, using every bit of energy he had to put distance between himself and the truck. Behind him, he could hear the truck's engine roaring to life, and he realized Carlos was going to try to run him down. But Marcus had one advantage Carlos didn't know about. During a college geology course, Marcus had spent a semester studying desert ecosystems in Arizona. He knew that the seemingly flat desert was actually full of washes, gullies, and rock formations that could provide cover from vehicles. Marcus spotted a narrow wash about 200 yards ahead and sprinted toward it. The sound of the truck getting closer behind him, he dove into the wash just as the truck came roaring over the ridge. The narrow channel was too small for the 18-wheeler to follow, and Marcus could hear Carlos cursing as the truck ground to a halt above him. But Marcus wasn't safe yet. He could hear Carlos climbing down from the truck, and within minutes the sound of boots crunching on gravel as the man began tracking him on foot. Marcus crawled deeper into the wash, trying to stay low and quiet. The narrow channel twisted and turned, paving some concealment, but he knew Carlos would eventually find him if he stayed in one place. Then Marcus heard something that made his heart skip. Another vehicle approaching. Through a gap in the rocks, he could see a second truck pulling up next to Carlos's rig. 3 men got out, all armed, all looking like they meant business. Carlos's backup had arrived. Marcus pressed himself against the rock wall and listened as Carlos explained the situation in rapid Spanish. He couldn't understand all of it, but he caught enough to know they were planning to spread out and search the entire area. 4 armed men in familiar terrain hunting one unarmed college student in the middle of nowhere. The odds were not good. But then Marcus remembered something his survival instructor had taught him. When you're outnumbered and outgunned, don't try to fight. Try to be invisible until you can find help. Marcus began moving through the wash system, staying low and quiet, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and his pursuers. The rocky channels led generally northeast, which he hoped would take him back toward the highway. He crawled for what felt like hours, his hands and knees getting torn up on the rocks, the sun beating down mercilessly. Behind him, he could occasionally hear voices as the search party spread out across the desert. When Marcus finally reached the end of the wash system, he was about 2 miles from where he'd jumped out of the truck. And there, shimmering in the distance like a mirage, was the highway. But getting there meant crossing open ground where he could be easily spotted. Marcus waited until the sun started to set, using the approaching darkness as cover. When he was sure his pursuers were far enough away, he made his break for the road. He ran harder than he'd ever run in his life, covering the half-mile to the highway in what felt like seconds. When he finally reached the asphalt, he was gasping, dehydrated and covered in blood from dozens of cuts and scrapes. But he was alive. A highway patrol officer found him 20 minutes later stumbling along the shoulder of the road. "Son, are you okay?" Officer Martinez asked, pulling over and getting out of her patrol car. "Need help," Marcus gasped. "There are men with guns in the desert, and drugs. Lots of drugs." Officer Martinez took one look at Marcus's condition and called for backup. Within an hour, the desert was swarming with law enforcement, federal agents, state police, DEA officers, and even a helicopter circling overhead. Marcus told his story from the back of an ambulance while paramedics treated his cuts and gave him IV fluids for dehydration. But when the Joint Task Force raided the location where Marcus had escaped, they found nothing. The trucks were gone. The men were gone. Even the tire tracks had been carefully erased. "They're professionals," DEA agent Sarah Chen explained to Marcus later. "This kind of operation doesn't leave evidence behind." Marcus felt a crushing sense of disappointment. After everything he'd been through, the bad guys had gotten away. But Agent Chen wasn't finished. However, she continued, "What you've given us is something we've been trying to get for years, detailed intelligence about how this particular smuggling route operates." She showed Marcus a map covered in pins and notes. "We've been tracking unusual truck movements along I-10 for months, but we never had specific about timing, personnel, or methods. Your description of Carlos, the truck, the pickup location, and the security measures gives us exactly what we need to set up an interdiction operation." Marcus looked at the map, seeing the pattern of the smuggling operation laid out in red pins and connecting lines. "You mean you can stop them?" "We can try. And thanks to you, we have a much better chance of success." The operation that followed became one of the DEA's most successful cartel busts. 3 weeks later, using Marcus's intelligence, federal agents set up an elaborate sting operation along the same route Carlos had been using. They positioned surveillance teams at truck stops, installed electronic monitoring equipment on suspected vehicles, and coordinated with Mexican authorities to track shipments at the border. Carlos Mendez drove right into their trap. "We got him," Agent Chen called Marcus the day of the arrest. "Carlos and his entire crew. $22 million worth of cocaine, enough weapons to outfit a small army, and evidence linking them to at least 15 other smuggling operations. But there was more. Marcus, when we searched Carlos's truck, we found something else. A journal with detailed records of his routes, his contacts, and his victims. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Victims. Carlos and his crew weren't just smugglers, they were serial killers. They would pick up hitchhikers, rob them, kill them, and dispose of their bodies in the desert. We found the remains of 11 victims buried along his route. The full horror of what Marcus had escaped finally hit him. It wasn't just about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Carlos had been a serial killer who happened to also be a drug smuggler. All young men, all traveling alone. All presumed to be runaways or drifters whose disappearances wouldn't be investigated thoroughly. Agent Shen's voice grew softer. Marcus, you didn't just help us bust a drug operation, you helped us catch a serial killer. The trial that followed dominated headlines for months. Carlos Mendez was sentenced to life in prison without parole for 12 counts of first-degree murder and numerous drug trafficking charges. His associates received sentences ranging from 20. But for Marcus, the most important moment came during his victim impact statement. 11 other young men didn't make it home from their journeys, he told the court. They were sons, brothers, friends. They had dreams, plans, people who loved them. Carlos Mendez stole all of that. Marcus looked directly at Carlos, who sat impassively at the defendant's table. But he also taught me something important about survival. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem the most helpful, and sometimes fighting back against impossible odds is the only way to honor the memory of those who didn't get that chance. Today, 8 years after that brutal day in the Texas desert, Marcus continues his work with Safe Passage, nonprofit organization he founded to provide safety resources for travelers. But perhaps the most important lesson Marcus learned was about the power of one person's choice. That day in the desert, I had a split-second decision to make: fight back or give up. I had no idea that choice would lead to stopping a major drug operation and catching a serial killer. You never know how far the consequences of one moment of courage might reach. Marcus still hitchhikes, though more carefully now, and he still believes in the fundamental goodness of most people. But he also carries with him the hard-won wisdom that survival often depends on trusting your instincts even when logic says you're being paranoid. Carlos taught me something important about human nature, Marcus reflects now. He taught me that evil can wear a friendly face, that predators often disguise themselves as helpers, and that the price of survival is constant vigilance. But Carlos also taught Marcus something else, that one person's refusal to be a victim can have consequences that ripple outward for years, affecting lives and communities in ways that might never be fully known. The hitchhiker's choice, made in terror and desperation in the middle of the Texas desert, had indeed changed everything. Not just for Marcus, but for countless people who would never know how close they'd come to becoming victims of a killer who finally met someone who fought back. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear quietly. The desert sun that had seemed so merciless that day had actually been preparing Marcus for his purpose, to stand as a beacon for other travelers, to prove that survival is possible even in the worst circumstances, and to show that courage in the face of evil can change the world. The truck had tried to carry him toward death, but instead it had carried him toward his destiny.